The explosion came without warning. One moment, Lance Corporal Jake Henderson was checking his rifle and joking with his buddies about the care package his mother had sent from Ohio. The next moment, the world turned orange and red. The shock wave hit him like a physical punch, throwing him backward against the concrete barrier. His ears rang with a sound that seemed to come from inside his own skull. When the dust cleared and his vision stopped swimming, Henderson realized what had happened. The supply convoy, the one that brought food, ammunition, and hope, had been obliterated. 3 Humvees, fully loaded with supplies destined for forward operating base striker high in the Afghan mountains, had driven directly into an expertly concealed IED. The Taliban had been watching, waiting, planning. They'd studied the route, calculated the timing, and struck with lethal precision. 40 soldiers died in the first 5 seconds. The blast was so powerful that it could be seen from the FOB itself, a towering plume of black smoke rising above the jagged peaks like an omen of darkness. Inside the concrete command center at FOB Stryker, the radio operators stared at their screens in disbelief. Static, nothing but static. Captain Michael Torres, the commanding officer, tried repeatedly to reach the convoy. Echo 1, this is Firebase Stryker. Come in, Echo 1. Silence. His stomach clenched. He knew that silence. He'd heard it before during his first deployment in Iraq. That was the silence of death. Within minutes, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The communication hub had taken shrapnel damage. Phone lines were severed. The satellite uplink was compromised. Forward operating base Stryker, with 1,000 Marines under its command, had been effectively cut off from the outside world. They couldn't call for help. They couldn't report their status. They couldn't do anything except wait and hope that someone somewhere would realize they hadn't heard from the FOB in hours. Back at the Pentagon, in an office cooled to an Arctic 68 degrees, Colonel James Harrison reviewed casualty reports with the detached efficiency of a man who'd learned to see combat deaths as budget line items. When his aide whispered the news about FOB Stryker, isolated, communications down, convoy destroyed, Harrison's jaw clenched. Not from concern, from calculation. Harrison had made enemies climbing the ladder of military bureaucracy. There were senators on the Armed Services Committee who wanted his head for the logistics failures that had plagued his command for 18 months. A rescue operation for 1,000 stranded Marines would cost approximately $50 million. It would require congressional approval. It would necessitate an investigation into how the convoy had been so thoroughly ambushed. It would expose his failed oversight, his poor intelligence assessment, his incompetent planning. Colonel Harrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, though he didn't know it yet. He would not authorize a rescue operation. Instead, he would contain the story, control the narrative, and eliminate the problem. These 1,000 Marines were, in his cold calculation, already dead. Why throw good money after bad? He stamped unrecoverable in red ink across the file marked 3rd Battalion FOB Stryker. He ordered all communications about the FOB to be classified at the highest level. He had his staff reclassify the Marines as presumed deceased in the official records. To the outside world, they would simply cease to exist. No investigation. No public outcry, no accountability. Meanwhile, in the Afghan mountains, the reality was far more brutal. The 1,000 Marines at FOB Stryker began the grim mathematics of survival. They had food stores designed to last 45 days if rationed carefully. They had water purification tablets and a well that sometimes produced brackish, questionable water. They had ammunition that was finite and precious. What they didn't have was any certainty that rescue was coming. Captain Torres called his officers to the command center. "We're on our own," he told them, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Command isn't responding. We don't know if they even know what happened to us." He looked each man in the eye. "We're going to tighten our belts, we're going to maintain discipline, and we're going to survive until someone comes looking for us." What he didn't say, what hung in the air unspoken, was that no one might come at all. That night, as the Afghan darkness settled over the mountains like a suffocating blanket, 1,000 Marines huddled in their bunks, watching their water rations decrease, their food supplies dwindle, and their hope fade with each passing hour. Somewhere in the Pentagon, their government had already written them off as dead. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been staring at the same spreadsheet for 3 hours, and her coffee had long since gone cold and undrinkable. She was supposed to be auditing supply chain logistics for the Department of Defense, a tedious but necessary job that paid well and required minimal emotional investment. Except something was wrong. Something didn't add up, and Sarah Mitchell had always been the kind of person who couldn't ignore inconsistencies. The Phantom Battalion appeared in row 4847 of her massive Excel file. Supplies logged for delivery to 3rd Battalion, FOB Stryker, Kandahar Province. Food shipments, 450 tons. Medical supplies, 2,400 units. Ammunition, 180,000 rounds. Fuel, 75,000 gallons. Everything meticulously documented, dates and signatures and authorization codes all properly filled in. Except there was no corresponding record of the supplies ever arriving at their destination. No receipt confirmations. No intake logs. No documentation of the supplies being used or stored. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she typed a query into the system. She searched for 3rd Battalion in the personnel database. Nothing came up. She searched for FOB Stryker. The results were restricted, classified, redacted with thick black bars that told her someone very powerful didn't want this information easily accessible. Her heart began to race. In her 5 years working in Pentagon logistics, she'd never seen a battalion disappear from the records like this. That evening, Sarah called her sister Alina. They'd grown up together in a military family. Their father had been an Air Force pilot until his death in a training accident when they were teenagers. Both sisters had inherited his sense of duty and his stubborn refusal to look away from injustice. Alina, now a lieutenant commander in military intelligence with clearance levels that would make most people's heads spin, answered on the second ring. "I found something strange at work," Sarah said carefully, speaking in vague terms in case the line was monitored. "Something that doesn't make sense. Can we talk in person?" Alina's voice dropped. "Is it serious?" "I think so. I think it might be very serious." They agreed to meet at their childhood home in McLean, Virginia, a place their mother had left to them after her death 2 years earlier. It was a secure location, off the radar of their official lives. Sarah arrived first, pulling into the driveway as darkness fell, her hands still shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Alina arrived 45 minutes later, and the sisters locked the doors, closed all the curtains, and turned off the Wi-Fi router. Only then did Sarah explain what she'd found. Alina listened without interrupting, her intelligence officer's mind already connecting dots, drawing conclusions. "Show me," Alina said. Sarah pulled out her personal laptop, never connected to Pentagon networks, and displayed the spreadsheet. Alina's face went pale as she scrolled through the data. These dates, this volume of supplies, for how many people? "The file designation suggests 1,000 personnel," Sarah whispered. Alina stood up and began packing, her mind working through classified information she couldn't share with her sister, but that confirmed Sarah's discovery was far worse than either of them had initially realized. "I need to access the intelligence files," Alina said finally. "The personnel records, the communication logs. I need to know what happened to these men." "Can you do that without being noticed?" Sarah asked. Alina smiled grimly. "That's what they train me for." For the next week, Alina moved carefully through classified databases. Late at night, from a secure terminal in her office, she accessed files that most people in the military didn't even know existed. What she found made her physically ill. Classified emails discussing the 3rd Battalion situation. Command decisions recommending resource reallocation. Medical reports filed without corresponding personnel records. And then the smoking gun. A memo signed by General Marcus Crenshaw and approved by Colonel James Harrison, dated 3 weeks after the supply convoy explosion. The memo was brief and cold. Recommend immediate reclassification of 3rd Battalion personnel as unrecoverable losses. Rescue operation deemed inadvisable due to cost-benefit analysis and strategic considerations. Recommend administrative closure of FOB Striker file. Alina printed the memo with trembling hands and drove directly to her sister's apartment. When Sarah read those words, unrecoverable losses, she had to sit down. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "They're not even looking for them," Sarah whispered. "They've just given up. They've written off 1,000 men like they're broken equipment." Alina's jaw clenched. Not just given up, actively buried the truth, which means someone very powerful doesn't want anyone to know these men are still alive. The sisters looked at each other, both understanding in that moment that they'd discovered something massive, something dangerous, and something that demanded to be exposed no matter the cost. Alina sat in the darkness of her secure office at the Defense Intelligence Agency, her fingers poised above the keyboard like a pianist about to perform a dangerous concerto. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. Most of the building had emptied hours ago, leaving only the night security team and a handful of dedicated analysts. This was her window. This was when she could move through the classified databases without drawing attention from automated monitoring systems that tracked daytime access patterns. She typed her credentials and began navigating through layers of encryption, each password more sensitive than the last. Her security clearance was high enough to access most intelligence files, but what she was about to do, systematically documenting evidence of deliberate abandonment, crossed into territory that could get her arrested. She pushed the thought away. 1,000 men were dying. That mattered more than her career. The first file she opened contained the budget analysis that had sealed FOB Striker's fate. General Marcus Crenshaw, a 3-star general with ambitions to make 4 stars before retirement, faced a brutal budget hearing before Congress. His department had been hemorrhaging money due to poor planning and cost overruns. A $50 million rescue operation would expose these failures, would trigger investigations, would destroy his record and his promotion prospects. But there was a solution, documented in chilling detail in an email chain between Crenshaw and Colonel Harrison. The subject line read, "3rd Battalion Strategic Options." Alina's hands trembled as she read. Crenshaw's first email. "The 3rd Battalion situation presents an opportunity. If we classify them as unrecoverable, we eliminate the need for a costly rescue operation. The funds can be reallocated to Project Sentinel." Project Sentinel was Crenshaw's pride and joy, a $200 million defense contract that would secure his legacy and his career advancement. Harrison's response came within hours. "Agreed. A rescue operation at this stage would be politically untenable and logistically problematic. Recommend we proceed with administrative closure." Another email, this one from a logistics officer named Colonel David Winters, raised concerns. "Sir, with respect, we have 1,000 personnel still communicating via emergency protocols. They're alive. We have a duty to attempt recovery." Crenshaw's response was ice. "Colonel Winters, you're thinking like a soldier. Start thinking like a strategist. These men are already lost. Why waste resources pursuing a ghost battalion? This conversation is closed." Alina photographed each email with her phone camera, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Every click of the camera shutter felt like a gunshot that might bring security guards running. But she continued, methodical and focused, documenting the conspiracy layer by layer. The next file contained medical reports for FOB Striker. Nutritional status assessments dated 10 days after the convoy explosion showed the Marines were already on reduced rations. A psychiatric evaluation noted declining morale and signs of depression among the officer corps. These reports had been filed and then buried, not discussed, not escalated, simply filed away and forgotten in the bureaucratic machinery. Alina cross-referenced the dates with communication logs and discovered something even more damning. After the initial reports, there were no follow-up medical assessments, no status updates, no progress reports. It was as if the Marines had been administratively erased, their ongoing suffering rendered invisible by the simple act of not documenting it. She found intercepted Taliban communications indicating that enemy forces had learned about the FOB's isolation. Fighter groups were organizing, planning an assault. The intelligence was dated 2 weeks ago. Someone at the Pentagon had known that FOB Stryker was about to come under attack and had done nothing, had authorized nothing, had simply let events unfold. By 2:47 a.m., Alina had compiled enough evidence to sink careers, to trigger criminal investigations, to prove that the highest levels of military command had conspired to abandon American soldiers. She'd photographed 43 separate documents. Each one was a piece of a much larger tapestry of moral failure. Meanwhile, Sarah worked her own angle. She'd begun accessing the logistics database during her normal work shifts, carefully extracting files that would support Alina's intelligence findings. One file per night, never suspicious, never raising alarms. She documented the supply chain authorization forms, the budget justifications, the reallocation of funds that would have gone to rescue operations. The sisters met in their mother's house again, this time with grim purpose. Alina spread out her photographed documents across the dining room table. Sarah arranged her extracted files beside them. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely condemning. General Crenshaw made a conscious choice, Alina said quietly. He chose a promotion over 1,000 lives. Sarah nodded, her jaw tight, and Colonel Harrison went along with it. So what do we do? Alina asked, though she already knew the answer. Sarah looked her sister in the eye. We burn it all down. We expose every lie. We make sure the world knows what they did. Alina smiled sadly. That's treason. No, Sarah replied, that's justice. The clock was ticking. Intelligence suggested FOB Stryker had perhaps 3 weeks of food remaining before starvation became the mechanism of execution. The sisters had to act fast, had to move decisively, had to find someone powerful enough to make the truth impossible to ignore. Sarah Mitchell sat in her apartment at 1:33 a.m., staring at the encrypted drive in her trembling hands. The small silver device contained classified documents that could destroy careers, end lives, and topple powerful men. It also contained evidence of a conspiracy so vast and so morally repugnant that keeping it secret would make her complicit in the slow murder of 1,000 American soldiers. She thought about her father, the Air Force pilot who died in that training accident when she was 16. He'd always told her that honor wasn't something you inherited or earned once and kept forever. Honor was a choice you made every single day, in every single moment, especially when making the honorable choice would cost you everything. This was that moment. Alina arrived at Sarah's apartment at 2:15 a.m., both sisters moving with the careful precision of people committing treason. They discussed this plan extensively, weighing every consequence, every risk. Court-martial, prison time, career destruction, loss of military benefits and pensions they'd worked years to earn, the end of everything they'd built. But the alternative, silence while 1,000 men starved to death, was unthinkable. We're really doing this, Alina said. It wasn't a question. We're really doing this, Sarah confirmed. They'd identified their target weeks ago, James Richardson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist at the Washington Post who had a track record of handling classified information with care and responsibility. Richardson had broken stories about military corruption before. He understood the stakes. He would know how to tell a story that couldn't be ignored or buried. Alina opened her encrypted laptop and initiated a secure connection using protocols she'd learned in intelligence training. They created an anonymous encrypted email account and attached Sarah's drive to a message. This contains evidence of deliberate abandonment of 1,000 U.S. Marines. Forward Operating Base Striker, Kandahar Province. General Marcus Crenshaw and Colonel James Harrison ordered their deaths by refusing rescue. The Marines have approximately 3 weeks of food remaining. Time is critical. Use this to save lives. Sarah's finger hovered over the send button. This was the moment of no return. Once this email went out, there was no taking it back. No plausible deniability. No way to explain away what they'd done. For Dad, Alina whispered. For the 1,000, Sarah added. She clicked send. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen refreshed. The email showed as delivered. The sisters looked at each other, and Alina began to laugh. A slightly hysterical, slightly desperate laugh that was somewhere between joy and terror. They'd done it. They'd crossed the line from loyal soldiers to rebels, from obedient officers to criminals in the eyes of the institution. They'd served their entire lives. What now? Sarah asked. Now we wait, Alina said. And we don't tell anyone. We go to work tomorrow like nothing happened. We maintain our normal routines. We act completely innocent. But waiting was excruciating. Wednesday passed. Thursday dragged on with agonizing slowness. Sarah attended logistics meetings while her stomach churned with anxiety. Alina analyzed intelligence reports while her mind screamed with the fear that Richardson might not publish, that their sacrifice might be meaningless. Friday morning, Sarah's secure phone buzzed with a news alert. She nearly dropped her coffee. The headline from the Washington Post screamed across her screen. Exclusive. Pentagon abandons 1,000 Marines in Afghanistan. General and Colonel ordered their deaths. The story was massive. Richardson had done more than simply publish the documents. He'd investigated, interviewed sources, connected the dots into an irrefutable narrative of conspiracy and abandonment. The evidence was presented in meticulous detail, each document photographed and authenticated, each email quoted in full context. By 7:00 a.m., the story was trending on every news network. By 8:00 a.m., cable news had abandoned all other programming to cover the developing scandal. By 9:00 a.m., Congress was demanding immediate briefings. By 10:00 a.m., federal agents were walking into Colonel Harrison's office. Sarah watched the news coverage from her Pentagon cubicle, her heart pounding as she saw Harrison being escorted out of the building by federal investigators, his face ashen and confused. The man who'd made the decision to abandon 1,000 soldiers was now being treated like the criminal he was. Within hours, the Joint Chiefs of Staff convened in emergency session. General William Blackstone, newly appointed and unsullied by Crenshaw's corruption, reviewed the evidence with cold fury. "Get those Marines out," he ordered. "Now, I don't care about the cost. I don't care about the risk. These men are American heroes and we left them to die. That ends today." At that moment in the Afghan mountains, the Marines at FOB Stryker received an encrypted radio message that seemed like a miracle. "Relief is inbound. Repeat, relief is inbound. Hold position and prepare for extraction. Rescue operation authorized at highest level. You are not forgotten. Help is coming." Captain Torres wept openly as he read the message to his men. The 1,000 Marines erupted in cheers that echoed through the mountains, tears streaming down faces weathered by despair. Two sisters had defied the most powerful institution in America, had risked everything, and had succeeded in saving 1,000 lives. But the cost of their heroism was just beginning. General William Blackstone stood in the Pentagon's Secure Command Center, his face illuminated by the glow of tactical maps and real-time satellite feeds. Around him, officers moved with controlled urgency, speaking in the clipped, efficient language of men who trained their entire lives for moments exactly like this. The Joint Chiefs had given him one directive: get those Marines home, and do it before the Taliban could organize a coordinated response to the incoming rescue operation. "What's our timeline?" Blackstone demanded. 6 hours to assemble the task force, came the response from Colonel Marcus Webb, commander of Special Operations Command. 2 hours for flight preparations. 8 hours flight time to the objective. We can have boots on the ground by 400 hours tomorrow morning. Blackstone nodded. It was fast, but not fast enough. Every hour that passed gave the Taliban more time to learn about the rescue operation and prepare an ambush. But it was the best they could do with the resources available. Do it. I want Delta Force, Navy SEALs, combat engineers, air support, everything we have. These Marines are coming home, and I don't care what it costs. Within minutes, the most classified rescue operation since the Vietnam War was set in motion. At Fort Bragg, Delta Force operators received the alert during a routine training exercise. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the unit commander, read the mission brief with grim determination. 3rd Battalion FOB Stryker, stranded, abandoned. Command is authorizing us to bring them home. The operators began gearing up with focused intensity, each man understanding the gravity of what lay ahead. At Naval Station Norfolk, Navy SEAL Team 6 received their orders. Commander David Morrison briefed his men in a secure room. "We're going to be flying into an active combat zone. The enemy knows we're coming. They're going to have fighters in the hills surrounding the FOB. Our job is to suppress enemy fire while the extraction helicopters load personnel. Rules of engagement are clear. Anything that shoots at us gets neutralized. This is a live fire operation. Stay sharp, stay alive, and bring everyone home." The Black Hawk helicopters were fueled and armed with precision. Each bird carried sophisticated defensive systems, flare dispensers to counter missile attacks, electronic warfare packages to jam enemy targeting systems, miniguns mounted on swivels. 24 helicopters in total, arranged in 3 waves. The first wave would carry the extraction teams and provide ground support. The second wave would carry the first load of Marines. The third wave would extract the final personnel and any wounded who needed immediate medical attention. Meanwhile, at Forward Operating Base Stryker, Captain Michael Torres received the encrypted radio transmission that changed everything. His hands shook as he read the message aloud to his assembled officers. "Relief is inbound. Repeat, relief is inbound. Rescue operation authorized at highest level. You are not forgotten. Help is coming." For a moment, there was absolute silence in the command center. Then someone began to cheer. Within seconds, the entire FOB erupted in a roar of joy and relief so intense it seemed to shake the mountains themselves. Men embraced each other, tears streaming down faces weathered by weeks of uncertainty and fear. Some soldiers fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the reality that they weren't going to die in this forsaken place after all. Torres immediately convened his officers. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "We're going to maintain discipline and organization. When those helicopters arrive, we're going to board them in an orderly fashion, wounded first. Then we rotate by unit. No panic, no pushing. We're going to show that rescue team what real Marines look like." He organized the Marines into boarding teams, assigned assembly points, designated which personnel would board which helicopters. He ensured that the most vulnerable, the wounded, the sick, those showing signs of severe malnutrition, would be prioritized for evacuation. It was the kind of organized leadership that transforms chaos into coordinated action. Back at the command center, General Blackstone watched the clock count down. Intelligence reports flooded in from reconnaissance drones flying over the objective. Enemy fighters were indeed moving toward FOB Stryker. Approximately 200 Taliban and allied fighters were organizing for an ambush. They had mortars, machine guns, and Russian-made anti-aircraft weapons. "They know we're coming," Webb reported. "Of course they do," Blackstone replied. "The question is whether they can do anything about it. ETA on our first strike package." "45 minutes. We have F-16s and Apache gunships inbound." Blackstone nodded. The Air Force would soften the landing zone with precision strikes, eliminating enemy positions while minimizing civilian casualties. It was a delicate balance, enough firepower to suppress the Taliban, but surgical enough to protect the very Marines they were trying to rescue. The helicopters began their engines at midnight, rotors spinning to life with a sound like thunder rolling across the flight line. Combat-loaded operators and pilots climbed aboard, each man checking his weapons, his gear, his teammate beside him. They were going into the Dragon's mouth, but they were going for their brothers. As the first wave of Black Hawks lifted off the tarmac, their navigation lights blinking red and green in the darkness, General Blackstone watched from the command center and whispered words that would have made any warrior proud. "Bring them home. Bring them all home." The rescue mission was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was now a reality, unfolding across the night sky, carrying 1,000 desperate men's last hope toward the Afghan mountains where death had been waiting patiently for weeks. The night sky above forward operating base Stryker erupted into chaos at exactly 4:17 a.m. The first indication came from the distant rumble of jet engines, a sound that made every Marine at the FOB look upward with a mixture of hope and dread. Then came the explosions. The F-16 fighters screamed across the darkness, their bomb runs illuminating the surrounding hills in sheets of orange and white light. Enemy positions that the Taliban had spent hours establishing were obliterated in seconds, reduced to smoking craters and scattered debris. But the enemy was still there, still fighting, still determined to prevent the rescue. The first Black Hawk helicopter descended toward the FOB's landing zone, its rotors chopping the thin mountain air. Inside the cockpit, pilot Major Richard Chen fought to maintain altitude as tracer rounds streaked past his windscreen like deadly fireworks. A round pinged off the fuselage just inches from his head. His hands were steady on the controls despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Taking fire from the eastern ridge," his co-pilot shouted. "I see it," Chen replied calmly. "Door gunner, suppress that position." The miniguns mounted on either side of the helicopter roared to life, unleashing a torrent of 7.62 rounds at the enemy fighters on the eastern ridge. The volume of fire was so intense that it seemed to create a wall of lead between the helicopter and the ground. Enemy fighters dove for cover, their weapons momentarily silenced. The Black Hawk touched down, and Delta Force operators poured out in a controlled assault, their weapons up and ready. They moved with the lethal grace of men who trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times. Within seconds, they'd established a perimeter around the landing zone, providing cover fire for the extraction teams. Inside the FOB, Captain Torres watched from the command center as the first wave of soldiers began moving toward the landing zone in an organized column. Despite their weeks of deprivation, despite their hunger and exhaustion, the Marines moved with military precision. Torres had instilled discipline into them, and that discipline now saved their lives by preventing the kind of panic stampede that could have turned the extraction into a disaster. Private James Rodriguez was helping to carry Sergeant Alan Matthews, who'd taken a piece of shrapnel in his thigh during the initial Taliban attack weeks ago. The wound had become infected, and Matthews had developed a high fever. Rodriguez was essentially carrying half the man's weight, but he never complained, never faltered. As they approached the helicopter, a Taliban sniper's bullet caught Rodriguez in the shoulder. The impact spun him around and he nearly dropped Matthews. Another Marine, Corporal David Kim, immediately moved in, helping support the wounded sergeant. They ran together toward the open cargo door of the Black Hawk, and medics reached out to pull them inside. "Go, go, go," the crew chief screamed, counting heads as Marines streamed aboard, 50 soldiers, the maximum the helicopter could safely carry given the altitude and weight restrictions. Inside the Black Hawk, the Marines were packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, their eyes wide with the shock of rescue. Some wept openly. Others stared in disbelief, as if they were afraid this moment would vanish like a dream. "We're loaded," the crew chief screamed into his radio. "Roger that," Major Chin replied. "Breaking ground now." The helicopter lifted off just as Taliban fighters came pouring out of the surrounding hills, their weapons blazing. But the air support was relentless. Apache gunships appeared overhead, their 30 cannons tearing through enemy positions. Another F-16 made a strafing run, its machine guns creating trails of destruction across the landscape. The second Black Hawk descended as the first one climbed into the darkness. Captain Torres watched from the command center as another 50 Marines rushed toward the landing zone. This time, he made sure the most critically wounded went first, men whose condition had deteriorated to dangerous levels, soldiers who wouldn't survive another day without medical intervention. Wave after wave, the helicopters descended and lifted off. The coordination was precise and deadly efficient. While one helicopter loaded passengers, another was already climbing for altitude. While a third was en route back to the FOB, a fourth was on final approach. The rhythm of extraction, the dance of rescue, continued through the night. By 5:45 a.m., after the sixth wave, 300 Marines had been evacuated. By 6:30 a.m., after the 12th wave, 600 Marines were airborne. The Taliban attacks had intensified, but the air support had suppressed them enough to keep the extraction moving forward. Captain Torres stood in the command center watching the numbers tick down. 700 remaining, 600 remaining, 400 remaining. The end was in sight. The impossible was becoming real. At 7:15 a.m., the final Black Hawk descended toward the FOB. Torres and his remaining officers boarded last, the commander ensuring that every single Marine under his command had been evacuated before he himself stepped onto the helicopter. As the final helicopter lifted off, leaving behind only empty buildings and shattered enemy positions, the 1,000 Marines erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very aircraft around them. They were alive. They were rescued. They were going home. Below them, forward operating base striker, the place where death had waited so patiently, faded into the darkness, a monument to abandonment finally overcome by courage and determination. The courtroom was a cathedral of justice, its marble walls and polished wooden benches gleaming under fluorescent lights that banished all shadows. Every seat was filled. Media representatives occupied the gallery, their cameras and notebooks ready to document every word, every gesture, every moment of accountability. Military officers in dress uniforms sat ramrod straight, their faces impassive but their eyes burning with the weight of what was about to unfold. General Marcus Crenshaw sat at the defense table, his three-star uniform now stripped of its dignity. His face had aged a decade in the weeks since his arrest. The man who'd once commanded respect through rank and power now commanded only pity and contempt. Beside him sat Colonel James Harrison, equally diminished, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. The military judge, a stern-faced colonel with 30 years of service, entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. The trial of the century for military justice was about to begin. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the emails first, Crenshaw's cold calculations about cost-benefit analysis, his deliberate decision to prioritize a defense contract over 1,000 lives. Each email was displayed on screens throughout the courtroom, magnified so that even the back rows could read the damning words. The courtroom fell silent as the evidence accumulated, layer upon layer, building an irrefutable foundation of guilt. Then came Captain Sarah Mitchell to the stand. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as this woman, the whistleblower, the hero, the traitor who'd become a savior, walked to the stand and placed her hand on the Bible. She wore her uniform with quiet dignity, her back straight, her eyes clear. The prosecution's lead attorney, Major Patricia Gonzalez, approached with respect evident in her bearing. "Captain Mitchell, can you please explain to this court how you came to discover the evidence that led to these charges?" Sarah's voice was steady and clear, carrying through the courtroom without amplification. "I discovered inconsistencies in supply chain logistics. A battalion designated as unrecoverable in official records was still receiving supply allocations. That didn't make sense. So I investigated further, and what I found was evidence of a deliberate conspiracy to abandon American soldiers." "Were you aware that accessing and copying these classified documents was illegal?" Gonzalez asked. "I was," Sarah replied. "I also knew that 1,000 men were dying while their government pretended they didn't exist. At some point, legality becomes secondary to morality." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge's gavel came down hard. Silence. But Sarah's testimony had struck a chord. Over the next several hours, she walked through the evidence methodically, explaining how she'd discovered the Phantom Battalion, how she'd recognized the pattern of deliberate abandonment, how she'd made the agonizing choice to expose classified information to save lives. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, he tried to paint her as a disloyal officer who'd betrayed her country's secrets. Sarah's response was measured and powerful. "I betrayed no one. I served the 1,000 Marines who were abandoned by their leadership. I served the Constitution, which demands that we protect American lives. And I served the honor of the military institution itself, which cannot allow such corruption to fester in its ranks." The gallery erupted in applause. The judge threatened to clear the courtroom if order wasn't maintained. Then came the testimony from the rescued Marines themselves. One by one, they walked to the stand and described their ordeal in gut-wrenching detail. Private Marcus Johnson described watching his best friend slowly waste away from malnutrition. Sergeant Lisa Chin testified about the moment they received the radio message that rescue was coming, how grown men had wept openly at the possibility of survival. Captain Michael Torres explained how he'd organized his men for extraction, how he'd kept discipline and hope alive when both seemed impossible. The most powerful testimony came from a young Marine named Kyle Patterson, a 19-year-old from rural Montana who'd nearly died from infected wounds during the abandonment. He described lying in the FOB's makeshift medical facility, watching his legs swell with infection, wondering if anyone in America even knew he existed. "I thought I was going to die in that place," Kyle said, his voice breaking. "And the worst part wasn't the pain or the hunger. The worst part was knowing that my own government had decided I wasn't worth saving. That's a wound that doesn't heal, sir." The prosecution's closing argument was brief and devastating. Major Gonzalez stood before the jury, a panel of military officers selected for their integrity, and laid out the case with surgical precision. General Crenshaw made a calculated decision to let 1,000 soldiers die rather than admit failure and risk his promotion. Colonel Harrison enabled that decision. These aren't failures of judgment. These are acts of deliberate abandonment. These are acts of murder, dressed up in the language of strategy and resource allocation. The defense argued about lack of direct evidence, about the complexity of command decisions, about the fog of war. But their arguments rang hollow against the avalanche of documented evidence and the haunting testimony of men who'd lived through abandonment. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On the 5th day, they returned with their verdict. "We find the defendant, General Marcus Crenshaw, guilty on all counts," the foreman announced. "Conspiracy to commit dereliction of duty, conspiracy to commit abandonment of military personnel, conspiracy to obstruct justice." The courtroom exploded. General Crenshaw's face crumpled. When the judge asked for his final statement before sentencing, he simply shook his head, unable to speak. "Life imprisonment without possibility of parole," the judge declared. Colonel Harrison received 25 years. As the verdicts echoed through the courtroom, Sarah Mitchell sat in the gallery and finally allowed herself to cry. Justice, incomplete and imperfect as it always was, had at least been attempted. The system had worked not perfectly, but it had worked. The 1,000 Marines who'd been written off as ghosts were now witnesses to accountability, seeing their own survival validated by a military court that finally recognized their worth. 3 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's main plaza as a bronze statue was unveiled before a crowd of thousands. The sculpture depicted two women standing side by side, their uniforms precisely detailed, their faces resolute and uncompromising. One held a folder of documents, the other pointed toward the horizon. The inscription at the base read simply, "In honor of those who chose conscience over command." Captain Sarah Mitchell and Lieutenant Commander Alina Mitchell stood together as the cloth was pulled away, their hands clasped so tightly that their knuckles turned white. Neither woman could speak. The weight of what they'd sacrificed, what they'd gained, and what they'd ultimately saved was too enormous for words. The 1,000 Marines who'd been rescued stood in formation before the statue, many in dress uniforms, many bearing visible scars from their ordeal, and many bearing invisible wounds that would never fully heal. When the cloth fell away and the statue was revealed, they erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Pentagon itself. But the road to this moment had been complicated and painful. The sisters had not escaped without consequences. The military had investigated them for illegal access to classified information, for conspiracy to leak state secrets, for violations of the Espionage Act. There had been tense meetings with lawyers, agonizing nights wondering if they would face prosecution, terrifying uncertainty about their futures. The public opinion had proven to be their greatest defense. The American people had rallied behind them. Senators had publicly declared that they would never allow two whistleblowers to be prosecuted for saving American lives. Editorials in every major newspaper called them heroes. Petitions with millions of signatures demanded their protection. The political cost of prosecuting the Mitchell sisters would have been too high, so the military brass, though seething, had ultimately decided to leave them alone. Still, their careers had been effectively ended. Both sisters were quietly reassigned to administrative positions with no path to promotion. Sarah was transferred to a logistics office in Honolulu with a desk job reviewing supply manifests. Alina was moved to an intelligence analysis position in Washington, D.C., removed from any real operational authority. The military had a way of punishing whistleblowers without technically prosecuting them. Slow exile, career stagnation, the quiet message that speaking truth to power came with a permanent price. But something remarkable happened in the years that followed. The sisters became legends in the military. Young officers studied their case in leadership courses. Military academies invited them to speak to cadets about moral courage. They became symbols of something the institution desperately needed, a reminder that honor sometimes meant standing against the institution itself. The 1,000 rescued Marines had been medically evaluated and given extended leave to recover both physically and mentally. Many struggled with PTSD and survivor's guilt. Some had developed permanent health issues from the malnutrition and stress. Private Rodriguez, shot during the extraction, had lost the use of his right arm and struggled with depression. Kyle Patterson underwent 6 surgeries to save his leg and spent years in physical therapy learning to walk without a permanent limp. But they lived, they survived, they came home. Congress moved quickly to pass legislation born from the scandal. The Mitchell Sisters Protection Act was signed into law 18 months after the trial. The legislation created an independent oversight board that could review and overrule command decisions to abandon deployed personnel. It established protection for military whistleblowers, ensuring that officers who exposed wrongdoing couldn't be punished through career sabotage or retaliation. It required that any decision to abandon a military unit had to be approved at the level of the Secretary of Defense and Congress. The law was imperfect and incomplete, but it represented a seismic shift in military accountability. Future generals would think twice before making decisions that prioritized budgets over lives. Future officers would know that speaking truth to power had institutional protection, however fragile. Sarah and Alina had also established the Forgotten Soldiers Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting military personnel suffering from abandonment trauma and combat PTSD. The foundation had helped hundreds of soldiers access mental health services, had provided financial support to families, and had become a voice for the voiceless within the military establishment. On the day of the statue unveiling, Sarah stood beside her sister and watched as the rescued Marines filed past the sculpture, many touching the bronze figures as they passed, some leaving flowers, some simply standing in silent tribute. That evening, the sisters gathered with some of the rescued Marines at a quiet restaurant in Arlington. Captain Torres, now retired from active duty, raised his glass in a toast. To the women who remembered us when our own government had forgotten. To the sisters who chose conscience over comfort. To the truth that sometimes heroism happens not on the battlefield, but in the quiet corridors of power where one person says no to injustice. Sarah and Alina raised their glasses, and as the Marines cheered around them, they finally understood the full weight of what they'd accomplished. They hadn't just saved 1,000 lives. They had fundamentally changed the military institution itself, had inserted conscience into a system that had learned to operate without it, had proven that a single act of moral courage could reverberate through generations. Years later, when people asked Sarah what she was most proud of in her life, she didn't mention her military decorations or her foundation. She simply said, "I stood up when it mattered. I did the right thing when the easy thing would have been silence. That's all any of us can ever do." The statue stood in the Pentagon Plaza, a permanent reminder that sometimes the greatest service to country came not from following orders, but from having the courage to question them. And the 1,000 Marines who'd been written off as ghosts lived their lives knowing that somewhere, two sisters had loved them enough to sacrifice everything. The end.